Sheldon. It's February 15th, 1995, and I'm with Warren Seamans, director of the MIT Museum. And we're going to talk today about Harold Edgerton, one of MIT's most famous folks. So I just sort of I thought it was important that we get some of the history down, you know, so that it doesn't sort of go by the boards. And you're someone who knew Doc very well, was connected with him over, what, the last 40 years of his life?
No, 30 years.
30 years of his life. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I guess I first met Doc very shortly after I came to MIT because I was in personnel, and personnel offices at MIT at those days were in the basement right under where his lab was, and he just moved to Building 4, what we think of as Strobe Alley. He'd moved there just shortly before. And I always had an interest in sort of exploring, and electrical engineering was one of the departments that I worked closely with. So I got through Strobe Alley, and I met him like almost everybody else did in those days by simply walking down Strobe Alley, and there he was. He'd come out and say hello, or you'd see him, and you know that not only ultra friendship, but sincere friendship that he managed to exude with anybody he came in touch, whether he'd ever see you again or whether he'd never seen you before, you were his friend. We actually worked in trying to find, while I was in personnel, trying to find some sort of technician for some short-term program that he was in. I don't recall much about that. But shortly thereafter, I moved to the Department of Humanities, and one of my first things I remember was Doc trying to save the birds that were dying because they were flying into this glass breezeway between the library building where Humanities was and Building 2. So he put these big cutouts of birds on that, of hawks, to scare the birds that were flying into this glass thing. So Doc's presence was always around. You knew he was here. And even in those days, he was obviously he was a mythical character. He wasn't just another professor. You knew that he was somebody that was very important in MIT's history. After we started what is now known as a museum in the summer of '71, and we moved into where we are now in this building, N52, in February of '72, one of my very first visitors in this very fledgling program was Doc. Doc came along because he'd heard that there was something trying to save MIT's history, and Doc, by this time, obviously was relatively certain where his place in history around MIT was going to be, but he was concerned that we were only going to save paintings and portraits and vases and that sort of thing, and he thought MIT stood for a lot more than that. We didn't even know what we were saving at that point. We were saving anything we could get. And one of the things we had found early on in this scouring of the MIT campus to find MIT memorabilia was an exhibit that Doc had worked with John Mealy, a photographic exhibit that had been taken in the late 50s to try and document the student body in that time. And this eventually came out in a little booklet, but it was actually a photographic exhibit that had been done, and Mealy gave that to MIT, and we found it. It was in terrible condition, but we put it up around our very makeshift offices. And Doc heard about that, and so probably the second time he ever came around, just poking around, he brought John Mealy in with him. So we all hit it off very readily from that point of view. And at that point he said, you know, we've got to save the history of the Institute, and the history is in the instrument, it's not in this other stuff. So really he was a big supporter of our operation from the very beginning. And I would say over the next, as we developed and as I was able to spend more and more time in this, and as I got to know the Institute better, I would get a call probably, at least twice a week if Doc was around asking about something or other. Do you want this, or shall I throw these photographs out? You don't really want this sort of stuff, do you? It developed into a relationship that was, I was always able to say yes to. I mean, that's an unusual relationship because he was helping us to build our collections, and he spread word far and wide about what we were trying to do. So he had the ear to the president, to the upper administration, and they were always there to listen to what Doc said.
What do you think right now it hasn't been that many years since Doc passed away, but what do you think the long-term legacy of Edgerton's going to be to the Institute?
Well, I think Doc personifies what was traditionally the MIT's way of teaching people, of the way that MIT thought people learn best. I think Doc personified that when he came here in 1926, I guess it was. The learn by doing, the hands-on method, all of these things. I think Doc not only personified that, but then went on to develop it by his own personality, pulling people in. I think, if anything, over Doc's period of time, and that probably was things that weren't particularly happy in Doc's career here, was that MIT moved very far away from that, with the introduction of computers in one sense and so forth, and with various people who wanted much more of a theoretical institute. MIT moved away from the hands-on thing, and Doc ended up toward the end of his life as one of the really last outposts of where a student could go and actually do something with his hands, his or her hands at the end. I think Doc's legacy is to really show the importance of that, and what Kim Vandiver and the whole Edgerton Center now is doing is pulling that back in. I mean, now it's an ongoing thing, and there's a lot of other people like Steinberg and well, I can't think of the names right at this point, but that are really see this importance and are pulling people back in, and teaching people, students, MIT students, that there's something beyond theory, that there's some, you need to, as for example, and Doc used this example himself, that in his age, and certainly my age, the average kid that came to MIT would have known how to take his Model A or his 49 Ford apart and repair it. Well, in the last few years, you just don't take most cars apart today and get them back to run. Mm-hmm. So the average student coming in today doesn't have that hands-on experience. So not only was the institute moving away, but society itself was moving away. You can't take your digital alarm clock apart and put it back together and hope to have it run. So Doc, I think, was very disappointed toward this and did everything he could to keep his course alive, bringing in Charlie Miller and other people to help keep that thread alive. And of course, his own magnetic attraction throughout, Doc in his darkest days of health could pull himself back together to give a most phenomenal lecture that would fill any auditorium at MIT or wherever else he gave. So he, by his own personal magnetism, he held this spirit of learn by doing, hands-on thing together. And now, again, now people see the importance of this, thanks to, again, as I said, the...
Not just here at the Institute, but really across all of education to some extent.
I think that's true to some degree.
Yeah.
I don't think most of the probably other technical institutes got as far away from, well, Caltech's probably an exception to that, but most of the others did not get as far away from hands-on education as MIT did for a long period of time. And a lot of Doc's contemporaries, I'm thinking particularly of Jay Stratton, Julius Stratton, who was president and exact contemporary of Doc's, felt very strongly that MIT was moving much too far away from the method you actually need to teach to understand technology, basically, And I think a lot of those people, I think what their opinion is being upheld very strongly today by a lot of things, not only Edgerton Center, but other things are showing a movement back toward hands-on approach.
What do you think about the sort of, what kind of influence did sort of Doc, when we try to describe him, oftentimes some people will say engineer, then they'll say artist, and they'll say entrepreneur, then they say inventor, then they say humanist, and they say teacher, depending on sort of who they are, and those words come in different order. I mean, do you think that represents an example of perhaps the kind of education or the kind of person someone can be if they sort of come out of the kind of education that the Institute sort of allows?
I think Doc was truly exceptional in every way along that line. I don't think the average engineer per se has the great appreciation of what made art. I mean, that Doc somehow encompassed. I can't answer your question specifically because he certainly was a humanist, because he understood the necessity of the human involvement in teaching. He was, in that magnetic attraction, made him a good teacher, of course. I think the last thing Doc probably would have ever called himself was an artist, yet he was very proud of the fact that one of the negatives that he'd thrown out ended up at the Museum of Modern Art as, you know, hanging on their wall. So he wasn't afraid of that. He had a wonderful artistic eye, because Doc, I think we pointed out this many times, if you look at a lot of Doc's negatives, they don't look very good. But Doc had that genius to go focus right into a certain part of a negative, blow that up, and get the phenomenal shot of a golf swing, whatever it might be. So he could understand the artistic merit of something within something else that very few people, most people would just print a negative and said, that doesn't look very good, you know, throw it. We either throw it away or we'll use that as the print. So I think you can, almost every point, yes, he was an engineer, yes, he was a true artist, I think, in a real sense. He was a humanist, he loved to teach. But primarily, I think he got right back down to that engineering, wanting to know how something worked and making sure that people understood how it worked, and the importance of making people understand how it worked. So it isn't an easy question to answer, but I think he was all of those things and a lot more.
Well, as to Doc, a fellow Midwesterner, that's fair to say, right? Or
yes, that's very true.
What kind of, how do you think that ever figured in Doc's life in terms of, you know, here he was, and, you know, as everyone's always, you know, always says around here, you know, boy from Nebraska makes good, comes to MIT, stays the rest of his life, with his wife Esther, who is also from Nebraska. What kind of,
well, I've just had reason recently to do a lot of reflective thinking about it, because this is, my mother was a Nebraskan, and she was born in the same town 5 years to the day of before Doc. April 6th, 1898. Doc was born April 6th, 1903, both in Fremont, Nebraska. My mother has just recently passed away, and I was out in that area talking about the nostalgia, and you think of what happened over the century that these people lived, approximately the 20th century, how simple life, I mean, we can't even imagine how simple life was in those days, in western part of this country. And Doc came from that, knowing that life was basically a very simple thing, and you could enhance it by strobe photography, you could do it. But I think he always had a great appreciation for the straightforward simplicity, and he never was a very complicated. I mean, I don't think he knew how to be complicated or obtuse or oblique. I mean, he was straightforward, and that was his Western way of doing things, his Midwestern, I should say. And I think based upon that, my mother also happened to be a teacher. And I think that was that Western way of looking at things that followed him through MIT. It was, to some degree, his charm, his straightforwardness, this saying, telling like it is, but always having people with you, and the importance of that. I think that the fact that he came from that section of the world gave him such a different view of what MIT was, that he could literally capture MIT. And you look at the other people in that period that were also either Westerners or Midwestern. Jay Stratton came from Seattle. Charles Stark Draper came from Missouri. Jim Killian came from South Carolina, which isn't West, but at least it's a different atmosphere. And a lot of our people that really, well, Compton, another contemporary who really made MIT different, was an Ohioan. A lot of these people came from that part back here and really perhaps appreciate MIT more for what its potential was than people who had sort of grown up around here. That's a pretty hard thesis to really prove in great depth, but in my thinking is that Doc's power came from that personality, which was primarily a simple country boy, you know, as he loved to say. You know, he loved that part
although Doc, I mean, certainly, I mean, you'd be the first to admit, I mean, Doc was a great showman.
Oh, of course.
I mean, Doc understood his country charm and yucked it up, you know,
of course,
more than once.
He played it for all it was worth, simply because he knew it worked. You know, but it was always a simple message. It was not a complicated message. He never fooled people. He never tried to work around people. He worked, you know, it was always a head-on approach from And everything I know about him, certainly that's true.
Do you have any good Doc stories that we ought to have in
Before you go
for
into
the record?
those, I think that drill is going to render your audio useless.
we just wanted to just
Okay. Whenever you're ready, Warren.
Okay.
favorite Doc stories. That was sort of the thing we
Yeah,
sort of
okay.
wanted to close
I
with.
think one of the my I think most precious memories of Doc are probably not individual stories about idiosyncrasies or any of that sort of stuff. There were enough of those, but it was his sheer fortitude and drive and determination to do what he wanted to do. And it's always been a model for me. I don't succeed nearly as well as Doc was always able to do, or nearly always. Doc saw one of his students, Paul Gray, become president of MIT, and this was in 1980. In the spring of, actually in mid-July of 1980, Doc had a very severe stroke. He was not really expected to recover from that, and he had overexerted himself carrying stuff from his car back to Hunter Memorial. But Paul Gray's inauguration was not until September of that year. And Doc announced through emissaries early on that he was, by God, going to march in that parade for his student. And by God, he was there to do it. And it was a wonderful tribute to Paul Gray, but even more so to Doc, that he could come from these literally depths. People had not expected him to live. After all, he was pretty well along in years. He was almost 80 at that point, I suppose, 77. And but by God, he was going to do it. He was going to see his person inaugurated, and he did. Well, I mentioned it slightly before. Doc had the amazing ability to have these very low spells, and then when a group, no matter where that group was or what that group, if they'd invite him to speak, Doc would get up for it, literally, up out of bed to do it. And I think Gene Mooney, his long-time secretary and assistant, really did a wonderful job of protecting him from this. And when she disappeared from the scene, he had no protection. So even at the end, if somebody in Oshkosh, Wisconsin would call and invite him to speak, and he got on the phone, he would say yes. And this, I think Charlie Wyckoff indicated the same thing, somebody in England who had gotten him on the phone and said, will you come? Oh yeah, I'd love to come. But what I really want to emphasize here is the magnetism that he had for the MIT student body. Now, he hadn't actively taught any courses for more than 20 years prior to his death, and yet every student knew him. Every student was a frequent Strobe Alley. They all knew him. They all had his postcards. And if he would give a talk on a 2 days' notice in Kresge, which seats 1,200 students, he'd have the place jam-packed and have them entranced, no matter what he talked about. He just had that ability to do it. And I remember at the dedication of Edgerton Hall, where he was, again, had a bad period of health. And he wasn't really, actually, as I recall, expected to come to that event. But nothing in the world would have kept him away from that. Another, if we go through our files, there's one fascinating thing about Doc, that he became interested in time capsules. And any building that was built on the MIT campus from about the mid-40s on has a time capsule. Now, sometimes these were Coke bottles with wax stuck in them, but Doc was involved in every one of those. He had a fascination of trying to preserve the time that you're doing something and make it so that somebody in the distant future would find that. And when the EG&G branch of, or the wing to the electroengineering and computer science building was being completed, I should say, when that third part of the building was being added, which was to be the EG&G building, Doc, of course, had to have a big ceremony to bury his time capsule for that. And it was a weird collection of materials that he put there. Now, I hope that that building never is destroyed so that we have that material. But someday somebody will find a wonderful collection of material that Doc found. And there's, when the media building, media arts building, was being dedicated, Doc, and this is verified, Doc would sneak out at night. He and Esther would sneak out around the edge of the building and plant time capsules around the edge of that building. And simply because he had this fascination with time capsules and would not, could not stand the thought that there was not going to be a formal time capsule ceremony for that building. Lord knows where he got involved in this, and I've never talked to Esther about it, but it'd be one of these wonderful things.
So what, do you feel like you have a responsibility of, you're sort of here to take care of the Edgerton time capsule, at least for a while?
Well, I think what we've tried to do, literally from working with Doc from the beginning throughout his life, was to gather just as much of his history as possible, and then with the cooperation of Edgerton Foundation and other things that have happened over the last 2 years, I think not only will his legacy be well preserved by having all the photographs in one spot, easily accessible to a very wide audience, but such as the seeing the instruments that are actually used, seeing that, so there'll be a in-depth understanding of his genius when it came to figuring out how to do something. If it didn't work this way, you tried it that way. You learned by the failure. You did it. So I think what the museum has literally been trying to do, with a lot of assistance from a great number of people, is to make this legacy a very much part of the available literature about MIT. And that's, you can't, MIT and Edgerton are almost synonymous from a point of view. I mean, he personifies the best things of MIT, and MIT is sort of personified, the best thing about MIT are personified in Edgerton. I mean, the two are almost inseparable when it comes to, so if you understand one to some degree, you understand the other one to an equal degree. And he will, I think the average student today is who goes to MIT, coming in as a freshman, say today, leaves here a little less prepared to face the world, because he or she did not know Doc personally, had never met him. Most of them have heard about him because of Stroballi, and that I hope will continue. I also hope that the material that we're getting into our database for this whole project will enable them, sitting in their dorm rooms, working at their own computers, to sort of explore through Doc's fascinating life and understand more about it. I think, just from what I know of what we've been able to see of it thus far, they will be able to do that, and I think they will. MIT students love to explore, and what a better way to explore than having your own hacking dig through a database of Doc Edgerton's materials. I think it will be heavily used that way, and I think greater understanding will come about Doc and MIT thanks to it.